good morning and good afternoon to all participants. Thank you to join the ITE Institute of Transportation Engineer Canada and the CARSP, Canadian Association of Road Safety Professional joint webinar today. And the title is, you can see there on the screen, Island Platform a Bus Stop, Imagining Trends, Technologies, and Lesson Learned. My name is Bob Chen, and I'm the road safety specialist in ISL Engineering and Land Service. I'm also the current Vice Chair for ITE Canada TLC, Technical Liaison Committee. So this is the more or less the second part of the job webinar, that the design guide for bus stop adjacent to the cycling facility that organized by ITE Canada and CARSP in October 2024. So ITE Canada and CARSP partnership was announced in June 7, 2023. And the idea was to maximize the quality and value of the member service in a variety of the form of consistent with the stated mandates, that including cooperation in delivery to national technical webinar session, potential to do the future cooperation on training, just like this one, promote a student leadership summit and mentorship program, reciprocal promotion of each other event and conference. Yes, I'm going to talk about that, talking about the events. I just want to mention about some upcoming ITE Canada and CRSP event before the webinar. For ITE Canada, we have the call for abstracts for our 2026 conference in May 31st and June 3rd in Victoria, BC. That's open until November 3, the call for abstract. Save for the day for the virtual technical symposium that will be on December 3. More information about the district and session event, you can find it from itecanada.org. For CARSP, the 2026 CARSP Road Safety Conference is being co-hosted with the Athletic Cooperative for Injury Prevention and Partnership in Halifax on June 14 to 17. Call for abstract to be launched in October with a late November deadline. CARSP also have 2 October webinars to be posted within the next week. Will be free for not only for CARSP member, also ITE member. One is on Vision Zero and the other on automatic speed cameras. They both free for the ITE Canada ITE member because one of them is CARSP Young Professional Committee will team up with the Toronto ITE student chapters. And the other study is the offer. We really want to share the idea for the other people. So that's good for the both ITE and CARSP member. Okay, hope you can check our email, check your email and the website to know more details. Okay, we come back to the webinar today. First, I definitely appreciate that Brian Patterson, the speaker from last year's webinar, can provide another informative webinar to our members again. So Brian is RVP's MCIP PMP RSP1 for the Senior Planner in Urban System. He's a Senior Transportation Planner and brings over 30 years experience in active transportation planning and design, multimodal transportation planning, and safety and accessibility. And Brian lead the development of the design guide and bus adjacent to the cycling facility and has lead numerous other design guide, including BC Active Transportation Design Guide. This year, Darren and Passmore will be join Brian to lead the webinar. Darren Passmore, MCL, PL, PH, is the owner and principal engineer for Street Matters. And he has experience in both private and public sector, leading the transportation project across North America and internationally. And experience as an engineer record for several programs and signature corridor project at the City of Vancouver, as well in industrial leading design guide and standard details. And his eye has an eye of detail in intimately familiar with the lazy dating complex trade-off. Furthermore, there are some other several great speakers from across Canada to join this webinar. There will be Katina Sawardi from Chanceling, Lacey Torres from City of New West, Troy McKay from the District of the Saanich, Bartek Komorossi from City of Montreal. Sorry, my spelling, my pronunciation. And anyway, Bai will introduce them and provide the bios before the presentation. The presentation will be around 60 minutes with about 20 minutes Q&A session afterwards. However, during the presentation, you can send the question through the Q&A function of the top of the team desk screen. We will gather them and then try to answer all questions at the Q&A. But for the easy reference, please add the speaker name you want to ask. And okay, I don't want to say more. Leave it to Brian to start the presentation. Friends, give up some drink from Brian. Thanks, Brian.
Perfect. Thanks, Borg. Good morning or good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you're joining the call from today. And thank you all for joining. It's great to see so much interest and continued interest in this topic of island platform bus stops. And I really appreciate the time you're all taking to join this webinar today. So as Borg mentioned, we're very excited to bring together this panel today. We have myself and 5 other speakers who are going to be speaking. And the focus of today is really to share lessons learned about island platform bus stops and things that we have learned since this design guide for bus stops adjacent to cycling infrastructure was published back in 2024. So we're really looking on what are some emerging trends, technologies, and lessons learned over the past year. To introduce myself again, my name is Brian Patterson. I'm a senior transportation planner with Urban Systems in Vancouver, and I led the development of the design guide for bus stops adjacent to cycling infrastructure. And I'll be starting the session today with an initial presentation just for some context setting, and I'll mainly be a moderator for the session today. But before we get started, I do want to do a brief land acknowledgement here and recognize that I'm joining from the traditional and unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in Metro Vancouver. But our speakers come from us across the country, and I'll invite them to note their traditional territories they reside upon in their remarks if they like. But on behalf of all of our speakers today, we want to recognize the important role that transportation plays in supporting reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and providing opportunities to support and enable the development of sustainable, safe, reliable, and affordable transportation options for Indigenous communities. And since we are gathering virtually from across Canada, we recognize and acknowledge all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and encourage you to take a moment to consider whose land you are on and how you can honor that relationship. This is particularly timely given next Tuesday is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and thought I would show this photo as an example of how we can work together with Indigenous communities. This photo here is showing a crosswalk, one of 2 crosswalks that were designed by an Indigenous artist on the Agnes Greenway project in the city of New Westminster. These crosswalks were designed by Rain Pierre, a local Indigenous artist from the Katzie First Nation. And this design was developed through a youth art competition with students from Kakite Elementary, responding to the theme of reconciliation. So as noted, we have a great roster of speakers today. I'll briefly introduce you to each of our speakers, and Borg did a brief introduction here as well. And really what we're hoping with our panel here is to bring a range of perspectives and experiences from across the country. So we have Dylan Passmore from Street Matters, Lacey Hurdle from the city of New Westminster, Bartek Komorowski, Bartek, I love your photo here, from the city of Montreal, Troy McKay from the District of Saanich, and Katarina Stevovich from Translake, Metro Vancouver's Regional Transportation Authority. And I'll provide more bios as we introduce each of our speakers throughout the session. And so the format for today, we'll be going through some brief presentations from each speaker, sharing their experiences and kind of a different angle or different learnings from each speaker. And we also are hoping to spend about an hour on presentations and then hopefully have 20 minutes or half an hour for questions and discussions. So throughout the session, we invite you to type in your questions in the Q&A function. So you should see that at the top of your screen, the Q&A box there, and then you can type in any questions as we go throughout the session. We'll generally aim to hold most questions until the end, but if you have a specific question that's directly targeted to one of the topics, we might take a question or two after each presentation if there's something specific or directly relevant to each presentation. As you're typing in your questions, if you are directing your question to a specific speaker, if you could just add that to your question, who your question is directed to, and then we'll aim to get through those at the end of the session. So to get started here and to frame up the context for this, in 2024, TransLink, in partnership with the BC Ministry of Transportation and Transit, developed the design guide for bus stops adjacent to cycling infrastructure to provide province-wide design guidance for what we're calling island platform bus stops, or also commonly known as floating bus stops in British Columbia. And the context for an island platform bus stop, as you can see from this photo here, these take place when we have the need to integrate protected cycling facilities while maintaining access for transit. And as we're finding more communities building protected bike lanes, there's a need to accommodate people with cycling with all age and abilities facilities, but also making sure there's adequate access to transit. And so in the case of, as you can see in the photo here, what this involves is the bicycle facility routing behind the bus stop and creating the island platform for people to wait for the bus and to board and alight the transit vehicle. And so while this is a design solution that's been used across North America, it has created a unique set of complex challenges for people with disabilities, and particularly people with sight loss. So the design guide was developed to provide a comprehensive set of planning and engineering guidelines for the planning, design, operation, and maintenance of bus stops adjacent to protected cycling infrastructure in a range of contexts and applications throughout British Columbia. The design guide provided lots of hopefully very useful guidance for practitioners. It didn't address all of the issues that were identified by people with disabilities, and we'll speak to that a little bit later in the presentation. It's a bit of an elephant in the room, and so there's some key issues that we're continuing to try and learn about, and that's largely what we'll be speaking to in this presentation today. So the intent of today's presentation isn't really to talk very much about the design guide. If anybody participated in the webinar we held with ITE Canada and CARSP last fall, that webinar provided an overview of the design guide. What we're focusing on today is what have we learned since the design guide was published over the past year. So as planners and designers, we recognize that transportation systems need to meet the needs of people with a diverse range of physical, cognitive, intellectual, psychological, and sensory abilities. And this has led to the growing implementation of cycling infrastructure intended for use by people of all ages and abilities, including children, seniors, and people with disabilities. And as I mentioned, has resulted in the implementation of island platform bus stops across Canada. But as noted, this has introduced complex challenges and has created barriers for people with disabilities, including people with sight loss, but all types of disabilities. And part of the impetus for the design guide stems from a 2020 decision by the BC Human Rights Tribunal, which determined that by installing island platform bus stops, there was a complaint against the City of Victoria, and the ruling was that the City of Victoria discriminated against the complainant and members of the Canadian Federation of the Blind who were looking to use transit in the City of Victoria. And there were a number of key issues raised in that ruling. The two kind of main issues were concerns that people with sight loss were not able to reliably sense if a cyclist was approaching. And secondly, that people with sight loss don't have certainty that a cyclist has stopped. So those were some two overarching issues through that ruling. And essentially with the design of island platform bus stops, the complainants were essentially saying that their ability to use transit had been taken away because people were so afraid to cross the bike lane to access the bus stop. So in response to that ruling, the city of Victoria was directed to install pedestrian-controlled audible flashing lights. But the ruling recognized that this was not the full answer. So it responded to this particular case, but this is why the design guide was needed. So we could kind of look at this in a more comprehensive manner. And when we're looking at why this is needed, we often hear, why are they needed? Can't buses just stop curbside like they currently do? Can't we just drop the bike lane? But I think the reality is we do need to find solutions that work for everybody, including people with disabilities and people who cycle. This is an example here. I was cycling with my son last year, and there was a bus stopped here. And so our options here without an island platform bus stop were to either wait for the bus or to have to weave into traffic on a busy arterial road, which isn't safe, particularly for children or for people who aren't comfortable cycling. So we're trying to find solutions that work for everybody. So the design guide, again, we won't provide too much discussion on the design guide itself, but a quick summary of what was included in the design guide. It included a wide range of treatments. There were 45 recommendations overall to address a number of issues and challenges. You can see some photos here, things like tactile directional indicators, secondary bus stop ID poles, having enhanced signage, and then some optional treatments like actuated flashing beacons or RRFBs. So we had a number of different typologies or configurations for island platform bus stops, and for each one we identified some core treatments or kind of required treatments, and then some optional treatments, which might be things you would consider in areas if you have higher risk or higher conflicts between people cycling and people trying to access transit. So it was provided, I think, a pretty comprehensive toolkit of options for practitioners to consider. However, the study, as I mentioned at the outset, did not fully address all of the issues identified. And kind of the elephant in the room that I spoke about is that there really are still two key issues remaining, and these are the two key issues that came out of that HRT ruling in 2020. And so that involves really having certainty for a person with sight loss and knowing if a person cycling is approaching, and knowing that that person cycling has stopped. So while the design guide provides a range of tools to help improve behavior and compliance, those two key issues still remain outstanding. And the guide acknowledged that and recognized that the guide is a first step, but that further research and pilot projects are required to learn more and to test out new technologies or new ideas and see how we can address these issues among other issues. Since the guide was developed, we've seen many communities across British Columbia applying the guidelines. This is an example shown here on a recently completed project in the city of Coquitlam on Guildford Way. And this design includes many of the design elements that are included in the design guide. Some examples of the design elements that are shown here. We have crosswalks, marked crosswalks at both the front and the rear door of the bus, tactile attention indicators at both crossing locations, tactile directional indicators across the sidewalk to indicate the presence of the bus stop. There's landscaping to bookend the island platform bus stop and to channelize pedestrians toward the pedestrian crossing locations, and detectable edge treatments with a half-height beveled curb adjacent to the sidewalk and the fence and shelter on the island platform. So lots of great elements, and kudos to the city of Coquitlam with this design. We've seen a number of other kind of similar examples and taking the spirit of the design guide. But when it comes to some of the other emerging ideas and technologies that are out there, this is a question we want to kind of explore throughout this webinar. We've seen a number of ideas out there. Some have been implemented, some are still just ideas that communities are thinking about. On the left, I was actually in Dublin, Ireland this past year, and Dublin is facing the exact same issues that we found with the design guide. And so they recently implemented a pilot project where they've installed actual bicycle signals. Right here in the photo, they're shown as amber, but they go to red, and there's a pedestrian activated push button here to trigger this to turn red. So that's kind of a regulatory approach with a bicycle signal. Or there's flashing actuated beacons, or RRFBs, which again came out of the HRT ruling. And then a number of other ideas that some communities are exploring. I haven't seen them in practice yet, but things like inlane lights or dynamic or enhanced flashing signage or things like that. So there's a consideration for some of these technologies, but maybe an overarching question is this too much, or are we over-engineering or over-designing with some of these types of technologies? And these are things that, again, we're learning as we go. So before passing it on to our panel of speakers, some of the ideas that we'll be exploring through the webinar today in each of the various presentations is learning about what does some of the latest research say, what have we learned from people with disabilities through engagement, and recognizing engagement continues to be really, really important. And even though we have the design guide now, that doesn't replace the need to engage with people with lived experience through the planning and design process. We'll be talking about context-sensitive approaches, particularly with some of those optional treatments. How do we address conflicting needs? How have designs evolved to reflect lessons learned? What is the role of technology, like bicycle signals or RRFBs? Looking at education and awareness, and broadly, what guidance is still outstanding or what guidance is still lacking. So those are some themes we will be exploring. And I'll stop sharing my screen now and I'll pass it over to Dylan Passmore. And I'll just give a brief introduction to Dylan while he's framing that up. So Dylan is the owner of his newly formed consultancy, Street Matters. He's a principal engineer with experience in both the public and private sectors, leading transportation projects across North America and internationally, and previously worked at the City of Vancouver. And I had the privilege of working closely with Dylan on the development of the design guide for bus stops adjacent to cycling infrastructure. And Dylan will be speaking to some emerging research and practices that he has seen over the past year. Over to you, Dylan.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so I'm just going to basically pick up where Brian left off. And, like Brian was saying, when we were working on the guide back in 23, 24, yeah, we recognized there was a lot of work ahead. We still had a lot of questions. I mean, island platform stops are pretty complex. There's a real nexus of mobility needs. So it's important we get them right. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of just, how collectively our understanding's evolving. And so I was going to touch on a little bit just some of the wayfinding aspects, pedestrian wayfinding, and just a few studies that have highlighted behavior around bus stops, and just touch a little bit on the elephant in the room that Brian's mentioned a couple of times. So in the guide, I mean, we were really putting a real spotlight on the importance of edge delineation, of defining space maybe better than we have in the past. And with that, also talking about designated crossings, how to deal with those, mark them, but also providing the attention or appropriate warnings. I'd say that sort of basket of design thinking is getting more and more traction. I'm seeing, more and more designs out there these days, like Brian was showing, that are clearly paying attention to those nuances. I'd say the space that is still kind of up in the air and we're still trying to figure out relates to a lot of the other basket of tactile features, particularly direction indicators, which we talked a bit about in the guide, but how to, in a North American context, how to orient them, how extensively to use them. There's not just the directional indicators, but there's others like the trapezoid that was developed down in San Francisco a couple years ago. We talked about all of this in the guide, but sort of framed it up as optional. It's really an area that's, I say, still unfolding, and still I see a lot of challenges with leveraging these tools. So I'll leave it at that. The other wayfinding piece that we sort of floated in the guide and tested out a bit through the pilot studies that we did was this idea of tactile layout maps that would be installed on the bus ID pole. So not talking about the Braille, bus stop number and route information, but something that actually in a tactile way communicates the layout of the stop, because they vary hugely. And I guess our feeling at this stage is that it's been sort of received as an interesting idea, but kind of lukewarm reception, I'd say. On the user side, it's we struggled a bit to kind of try and come up with something tactile, like a tactile language, that explains the layout in a simplified way, that wasn't too complex, but it's a new language. It's kind of takes a bit to understand these panels. So there was that, and then on the practitioner side, it creates a real challenge in terms of asset management. I mean, every single one has to be custom designed and maintained. If it gets vandalized, or the location of the sign and its orientation is really important. So any changes to bus stops, which can be pretty frequent, requires a new sign. So there's that practicality to it as well. So then the other thing I just want to touch on is this idea like of a typology of different stops, which we included in the guide. So we call it like the conventional island platform, where you've got a platform that's sort of a full width, not in this image, but often the shelter would be located out on the island, and there's enough room for a ramp to deploy from the bus, and someone using a wheelchair to access that ramp. So there's that. Then there's more constrained scenarios, which it's an example from Montreal. Bartek's going to talk about that a bit later, but where you only have space, say, for a step out area, or the ramp to deploy from a bus, versus a uber constrained scenario, like you see many of these around Toronto, or Copenhagen for that matter, where someone stepping out of the bus is stepping into a raised protected bike lane, and vice versa, versus integration of a stop with a multi-use path. And these like broad four categories, that's how the guide was framed up, but we're also seeing a very similar sort of typologies used in other design guides, and even research and studies are often framing up findings with a very similar typology. And so I also just really feel like this language, or this understanding of how we talk about island platform stops or floating bus stops, there's a bit of a consensus growing that these types are pretty fundamentally different from each other in terms of how we think about how to design them, and also about how people use them. I'll just say we probably in the guide probably could have come up with maybe better names, simpler names for these types, but I'll get to that in a second. But the other layer to the typology is this idea of a hierarchy. And we talk about that in the guide, this idea of, okay, here's a preferred type. If you can't do that for whatever reason, you're dealing with really constrained conditions, here's the next in line, and then can't do that, the next in line, et cetera. That's something I'm also seeing, coming up in more and more design guides. The shot of a kind of a flow diagram from AC Transit's recent design guide. So I'm just going to also touch on a few interesting studies that kind of came out right around the same time as the design guides. The first one I want to mention is at a Massachusetts DOT. They funded a look at a bunch of floating bus stops. They were looking at LiDAR data to track movement and speeds in the area. And just one of the initial observations they made is like a lot of the stops out in the field today don't look alike. There's a lot of inconsistency. And so interestingly, they framed their findings around a really similar typology. They just called it like full width platform versus partial width platform versus no platform at all, i.e. the Toronto scenario I was just talking about. So similar typology to the TransLink guide. Just a couple things that I thought were interesting coming out of that. One was they were just noticing a lot of the stop designs that had a lot of fencing and those kinds of obstructions were resulting in a lot more walking in the protected bike lane. This is echoed in a Living Streets study I'll talk about in a second. And the other just thing they were noting is that cyclists were much more likely to adjust their alignment, their travel path in dealing with interactions with pedestrians than they were their speeds. So that's just kind of touching on a little bit of the complexity of the behavior that we actually see at these bus stops. So that was echoed by a Portland study here. So I'll just talk briefly. There's an interesting PSU study that also came out around the same time. They looked at a single corridor with a bunch of stops, and they were all this kind of partial width type. Looks a little different from what you see in the guide. If you look closely, it looks a little different from the Montreal case. But Oh, and the other thing that was kind of interesting this quarter, it actually crossed a jurisdictional boundary. So this was what a bunch of the stops looked like, and this is what a bunch of other stops looked like. So half of them were city design, the other half were state design. But anyway, one really interesting thing for me that I've been wondering about for a while with this type is where are people waiting and standing? And that was one of the big findings here, that people were in fact waiting in the sidewalk area where the shelter and bus ID pole, all that transit furniture is located. So that for me is good and reassuring, because that was certainly the intent with how we framed it in the TransLink guide. Another thing that was the bus operators were observing people with mobility aids sometimes struggling with the TWSIs traversing them. That's also something that was really back of mind for us when writing the guide, and sort of a cautionary note with ideas of, kind of really blanketing these platforms and whatnot with especially directional indicators, that there might be some trade-offs and some impacts for people with mobility needs. And then the other thing that was interesting to me, bicyclists were shown slowing down in response to their context. So, if there were a bunch of transit riders present, they noticed a drop in cyclist speed. If there was a big bus at the stop, the speeds drop. And so there is this kind of thing that happens, I think, at this type of stop, and also the more constrained, like that Toronto example, that's a little different from the more, the full width design approach, where like that bus, its presence is much more felt. Okay, pivoting to a UK study done by Living Streets, super interesting, rich study that happened over 2 years. They looked at only 10 stops, but did a real deep dive. Really interesting mix of qualitative and quantitative. Real quick, I think the thing that was interesting for me is they really did a good job of unpacking just how complex behavior is at these stops. And they highlighted that it's really rare to see somebody cross a protected bike lane at a stop like this in that sort of traditional use of a crosswalk that you would think of, someone crossing a roadway. Rare for someone to cross at right angles. Rare to see someone, come up, wait, look for a gap, cross. And I think they included a bunch of traces in their report that really, I think, hammered that home, just how much complexity is going on here and just how complex the behavior is as a result. They even noted that at a bunch of the stops, more than half of the pedestrians crossing the protected bike lane weren't even crossing to access transit. Of course, a lot of these stops are located near an intersection, and so they highlight one example where people are just interacting with the stop and the bike lane within the vicinity of the floating bus stop, but to cross the street or to have a look down the street. So that was, for me, just kind of a bit eye-opening. And so one thing that they really underscored is just how much context matters. And they framed it as busyness and complexity being two features that really create kind of unique conditions. And so locations where we have really, large volumes, frequent crowds of pedestrians, groups of pedestrians, say frequent transit service, pedestrians exiting shops, talking with friends, all that adds complexity. A two-way protected bike lane also adds complexity to pedestrians. And all of this, for a pedestrian with vision disability, this increasing complexity really compounds their struggles. So the researchers kind of tried to really carve out these busy and complex locations and suggest, identifying those and treating those as sort of a unique condition, but also super important by virtue of being really busy. And so I think for us as practitioners, maybe thinking a bit about identifying those locations, and maybe those are the locations where we really need to be talking about some higher order interventions, acoustic cues, beacon signals, like all that stuff that Brian was starting to talk about. Maybe that's the context where those start to make sense. Real quick, I'll just mention there is a early stages, but an ongoing study right now, TCRPB 51. I'm involved in that, and it's really focusing exclusively on the pedestrian experience, especially people with vision disabilities, and trying to test out a whole host of treatments to really unpack behavior, yielding, indicating intent to cross, those sorts of things. So stay tuned for that. So I'll just wrap this up just to, hey, mention we're aware there's a couple of cities, so City of Vancouver, that are looking at hey, does providing an audible queue have merit? Does it seem like that could have some benefits? So City of Vancouver are looking at exploring some low-tech solutions. They've been calling it, I think, the clinker clanker. So something that could be installed in like a bike lane, and you get the clank, as somebody goes across it. And the idea there is, something low cost, low maintenance, scalable. Of course, the trade-off with that is minimal control over volume and no ability to kind of turn it on or off as needed, that sort of thing. So we are aware of another jurisdiction looking at a more high-tech solution, and it might involve some kind of active or passive detection of approaching bikes, installing some speakers to make sound, maybe leveraging APS technology in a way that you could respond to ambient noise levels, maybe only activate the system as needed. Of course, the trade-off with that approach, though, is it's going to be more costly to install, harder to scale out across the city, and it's probably going to have some higher maintenance requirements. So could talk about this a lot more, but I just want to let you all know that people are starting to think about these things and explore them, and I think it's super, super interesting. So I will wrap up with that. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Dylan. Really appreciate that, sharing some of that research and just showcasing just the complexities that we're looking to address here, and really how it comes down to human factors and behavior, and it's very nuanced. So I'll pass it to our next speaker, Katarina Stevovic. She comes to us from TransLink, Metro Vancouver's multimodal transportation agency. Katarina brings over a decade of dedicated transportation experience in the public sector, and she currently manages the major road network in Metro Vancouver. And she'll be speaking to some key insights TransLink has had since the design guide was published. So over to you, Katarina.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Give it a second. Awesome. So thank you so much for those kind words and introduction. I have the pleasure to present all the work that we here at TransLink have done. I want to start with a quick overview of who we are at TransLink. We were created in 1999 as Metro Vancouver's Regional Transportation Authority. We oversee approximately 2,600 lane kilometers of the major road network. Within here, we are encompassed of 23 local governments. We operate over 240 bus routes. We have 3 SkyTrain lines, 1 commuter rail, and a C bus. So we have a lot of good work that we oversee. So what have we really done since publishing the guide last April, and what does that really mean? Alrighty, so once the guide was completed, we really saw our role started transitioning. And this is really where a lot of the work started. So as the guide was developed, there were some key themed areas for further work and development. And what we really wanted to focus on was getting consistency for how users would experience and expect to cross these facilities throughout the region. So if you're on a bus in one city or going to another, it should be roughly the same. And with that, we saw that our role was really transitioning into facilitating and connecting all the dots. So we were working very closely with the local governments as well as our operating companies to help overcome some of the stuff. As Brian mentioned, this is not ideal. There's still a lot of work in progress when it comes to implementing and designing these features. So what we really worked on was making sure that all other design solutions were exhausted before this would be implemented. This is really key as a role to facilitate with our operating companies and local governments. So we would see if there was any opportunities for bus stop balancing, if there was a way to relocate some of the buses more closer to intersections where it could be integrated with a signalized crossing instead. And really, that is where we started noticing our focus on education and awareness. And so what we started noticing the most was if we don't start changing the behavior of what's expecting here with this infrastructure, then doesn't matter how good the design is, we'll still have some issues to overcome. And so what we ended up doing was working internally with our great marketing team to start really campaigning on the education portion. We piloted a couple bus stop announcements, which I'll get into, and also featured a good video where we were working with our local hub, which is our cycling group as well. So a couple key things also that we noticed is like a tip and trick was if you are looking to develop something like this in your own region, make sure whatever you're doing for the online or web-based, it's really adapted to all the technology out there. There's a great resource that CNIB Access Lab provides. And so that has been really monumental as we're working through this. So I'll come over to the video that we created.
This is an island platform bus stop.
An arrow points to the bus stop.
It helps keep people cycling or rolling safe by bringing the bike lane to the other side of the bus stop.
A side-by-side comparison shows how an island bus stop separates bike lanes from the road.
With this type of bus stop, buses no longer need to cross the bike lane to reach the stop. But this also means that pedestrians need to cross the bike lane to reach their bus stop. Remember, pedestrians always have the right of way, so cyclists and rollers must always yield. When approaching an island platform bus stop, follow these steps. 1. Slow down and scan for pedestrians. 2. If you see a pedestrian needing to cross, stop and let them know it's safe to do so.
Go ahead.
3. Pay extra attention to people using mobility aids. This could be someone with a guide dog, on a wheelchair, or walking with a mobility cane.
A person with a mobility cane and guide dog approaches the crosswalk.
Oh, okay, I need to stop here. There's some truncated domes. I am at the bus stop.
Stop and verbally let them know it's safe to cross.
Safe to cross?
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, now we can cross. Okay, forward.
Remember, slow down when approaching an island platform bus stop and stop if you see a pedestrian.
Go ahead.
Learn more at translink.ca/IPBS.
Okay, so that was one of our promotional videos and education features that we were able to do. That was all done in-house. Like I said, there was a lot of coordination with our CNIB contacts as well as the hub. The other project that we've been piloting that just recently started earlier this month was onboarding announcements. We have identified 2 routes, one in Vancouver and one in Westminster, where this will start working, and we'll slowly start getting some more feedback as it gets developed. Now, this was one of the treatments that was identified through the guide as being one of the most effective ways to actually increase that awareness. So again, you might get new users that are using our bus routes and need to be aware of what's going on. So this is something where we have it linked to the bus stop announcement. One of the things that we did notice, and this is a little tip and trick, is to keep all the phrasing very short and simple. Originally, it was a little bit more elaborate. So the key with all of our user groups as we were working with them was to keep it right to the point. What we've also noticed so far as it's been pilot is actually to have it linked to when the door opens. So there's a bit more integration on that for future development. Like I said, this is still our trial period and we'll be able to get some more insights and we will play it.
Next stop, car arrow, street, bicycle lane present. Please use caution.
So this is some of the work that we've been doing on our own facilities where we have a little bit more control. But you might want to ask, what does the future moving forward really look like, and what are we planning on developing and continue to work on? As it's been mentioned, this is really very new in its stage of development, but we're looking to actually have a digital inventory where you can get integration with online maps, how users are trip planning, their destination from one location to the other. There's also another area of operation and maintenance to see what kind of better tactile treatments we could use, material, and how can you continue with some interactive reporting if there's any issues out in the field. We also have another one where it's monitoring. This is very key. So as mentioned, a lot of the sites that we're looking at doing this, or if people are looking to actually build it in their community, it's very unique and it might not be always the same solution from one location to another. So really having an effective way of monitoring and reporting back to see, is it doing what you're expecting it to do or not? So this is something that we're working on with the region as well as we're identifying some of these projects and working on that. So I'm going to wrap it up, but thank you guys very much for this. It's been a lot of good work on our end. Like I said, we really wanted to focus on the education and awareness piece. The behavioral lens is something that we thought is very important because no matter how good you design it, if it's not being used the way it's supposed to, then the effectiveness isn't there. So we're going to continue working on that and building it out. It's been 1 year post, and so we're excited to see what the future holds on that end. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Katerina. Really appreciate that, and great to see Translate moving forward with some of these education pieces and pilots. It's great to see. So our next three speakers, we're going to kind of dive into a municipal perspective and share some municipal experiences. We'll start with Lacey Hurdle. Lacey's a senior transportation engineer with the City of New Westminster. Lacey's been working in the realm of active transportation since 2009 and has developed transportation plans, designed protected bike lanes, and supported a range of traffic safety initiatives. And she will be speaking about her experience engaging with people with lived experience in the design of an island platform bus stop. Over to you, Lacey.
Thanks, Brian. Make sure everybody can see my screen here. Yeah, so everything that's been shared so far has been what has been very useful for us in New Westminster as we've started on a project on East 6th Avenue. And I'm going to talk through a bit of the context setting first and really just focus in on what it's been like engaging people with lived experience. So, like I said, I'll shape up the project contents, talk about engaging people with lived experience, and then what design we actually landed on for our project. So understanding the context, for those of you who on the call may not know where New Westminster, British Columbia is, we are east of Vancouver and Burnaby. We are on the north portion of the Fraser River, and we're about 5 kilometers square in size and about 80,000 people. For the project specifically, 6th Avenue kind of runs like an east-west street in New Westminster, and the section that we're looking at for our project is between Cumberland Street and McBride Boulevard. And the photo here on the bottom of the screen is looking west along East 6th Avenue. So how this project came to be is that the City of New Westminster had a civic facility called the Canada Games Pool that was being redeveloped into a new aquatic and community center. And you pronounce it Thomas Out Aquatic and Community Center, which opened in 2024. Since opening, the community center has received the Rick Hansen Foundation certification for accessibility, as well as Prix Versailles Award. So it's really a gem within the community. And one of the things that's really important to the City of New Westminster is we recognize that one of the largest growing demographics in the city is older adults. And so really having a focus on wanting to make sure our civic facilities are accessible as possible for all ages and all abilities. And so that's really foundational for when we get into talking about this project. So the project is actually the offsite rebuild as part of the new Aquatic and Community Center. The corridor length is approximately 330 meters. And what it entails is traffic safety improvements, a new full signal at the intersection of Cumberland Street and East 6th Avenue, improving the existing transit stop that's outside of the facility, of the civic facility, as well as rebuilding a bidirectional bike lane. So before I move on, I'd like to pause for a moment and just ask everyone to think about someone in your life who is an older adult. They may have just entered older adulthood, they may have been in older adulthood for a while, but just try and hold them in your mind as we go through this presentation and think about their own environment in which they get around and travel between, maybe it's appointments or getting groceries or things like that, because I think this is one of the pieces that helps anchor when we get into talking about the engagement phase of this project. So as Katerina mentioned, one of the things that we did is we went through the exercise of seeing, is it even possible to, change whether the transit route and the bike lane are on the same street. And through this project, we got to the answer of no. So we asked ourselves, can the bikeway be one way instead of bi-directional? Just to think about trying to reduce the levels of complexity at this location. We worked with TransLink and Coast Mountain Bus Company to see, could we move or consolidate the bus stops, and landed at no. And could we relocate the bus stop so it would be close to or adjacent to a signal, providing that signalization. But eventually we landed on all of these were no's. So our scope was really limited. The bus stop was staying where it was. The bike lane, it was going to remain bi-directional and stay where it was. And so really we were in this position of the bus stop needs to be as inclusive as possible. So we worked with a consultant and they used the BC Active Transportation Design Guide and created this proposed design for the bus stop. You can see it has the core treatments that Brian mentioned and some of the optional treatments as well. And so this was a really great starting point for us to go out and talk to people with lived experience. And so as you're still holding in mind that person in your own life, I really want to talk about what engagement is. This is from IAP2, the International Association for Public Participation, just talking about what is engagement in terms. It's a spectrum. There are opportunities to talk through things, and in New Westminster, we have a little bit different spectrum. We actually don't consider informing as part of our engagement. We consider informing to be communication with the public. We're giving you information about a project. We may post information to the website. We may create notification letters and send them out. That's really communication about the project. So what was different about this project is we were open for influence. So we have the proposed design, but we were open to be influenced about what that ultimate design would look like based on the feedback we would receive from people who had lived experience. And so what did that look like for this project? Well, we knew the primary concern, as Brian highlighted there too, one, people sometimes can't hear the cyclists approaching. But when we were talking with CNIB, we really heard that the primary concern for them is this behavioral piece of cyclists not being willing to stop and give right of way to people crossing the bike lane to get to and from the bus. And so at this point, I didn't really know how do we do a site visit with people who have different abilities, and reached out to a few colleagues, and really what we landed on is hiring an orientation and mobility specialist. And I got a crash course in what orientation and mobility specialists do. And really they're so key in being able to provide that comfortable, safe environment for people who have different abilities to come out and be on site, and to really help them feel comfortable and navigate the space and provide feedback. And so we had CNIB staff came, one with lived experience. We had Rick Hansen Foundation staff come, the orientation and mobility specialist, and then another community member with the lived experience of blindness. And so they came to the site, they experienced the site, and I'll show you a photo of what the existing conditions look like. And we just navigated the whole site, not just specifically the bus stop area, but the whole corridor, being open for influence to hear what they had to say. And it was really surprising, some of the pieces that came out. One in particular is that the existing bus stop actually felt more intuitive to people with blindness than what we were proposing with the kind of floating island or bus platform. And the existing configuration actually requires cyclists to stop, and that was addressing that primary concern that had been identified. They told us we needed more wayfinding, particularly tactile wayfinding to the bus stop. We needed to have the bus shelter so that people could wait. And so this is what the existing bus stop looks like, looking westbound from the driver's perspective up in the left-hand corner of the screen. And I just want to say that this was a quick build bus stop bidirectional bike lane configuration during the construction, the demolition of the Canada Games pool, and the construction of the new Thomas Out Aquatic and Community Center. And so in the lower right-hand side of the screen is looking eastbound from the pedestrian's perspective. And so I don't have a photo of the bus stopping here and deploying the ramp, but I know you can use your imaginations. The ramp, when deployed, blocks the bike lane, and cyclists do have to stop. And so this is the key point that was feedback for us during the design. And so our consultant took this information away to create a tailored design based on this feedback. And so I'm actually going to start in the lower left-hand side of the screen and then go clockwise. So really, the bus stop area and the bike lane will continue to overlap. The bike lane is raised through the bus zone, and there's horizontal deflection on the approach. So we have a 3-meter bidirectional bike lane that's reduced to 1.8 meters through the bus zone area. This means it's one way for cyclists, and the right-of-way prioritizes the pedestrians going back and forth. If we go clockwise, the transit shelter placement was really key, wanting it to be adjacent to the sidewalk that Katarina spoke to, about being consistent about where other bus stops are in the region. That was something that we did hear feedback from the community members. And then having a tactile indicator so that it actually provides that direction to the civic facility. And you'll notice there's a small break in the tactile indication. And that was really because we heard from people who maybe want to traverse the sidewalk east-west and don't want to have to go over it, especially if they're in a wheelchair. It just provides a more level of comfort for them. You can see the delineation of the bus stop area with the concrete versus the landscape bookending. And then lastly, what we heard both from the people with lived experience and the orientation mobility specialists, we did not need to be providing the tactile domes at the back door of the bus stop. Really, people are trained to only use the front door. So to really focus those tactile pieces for the front door and to and from the facility. So that's been our experience in New Westminster. This project is set to begin construction this fall. And yeah, so be able to report back in the future on how that's going. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lacey. Really appreciate the perspective on kind of how you engaged with people with lived experience and how that informed the design, and some great lessons learned moving forward, and really echoes, like in the design guide we mentioned, the design guide shouldn't substitute engagement. It's a starting point to use that to then engage and come up with locally based solutions. So that's great, and some really great lessons learned there. Next, we'll pass it over to Troy McKay. Troy is a Senior Manager of Transportation and Development Services with the District of Saanich. Troy has over 18 years of experience in municipal engineering and has helped shape Saanich's growth and mobility over those years. So I'll pass it over to Troy.
Great, thanks, Brian. Good morning, good afternoon for those that are joining us from across the country. Pleased to be here today to share our experience in Saanich, which is on Vancouver Island on the coast of BC. Talking about island bus stops from the island today. We are the largest municipality in the capital region here, in just outside of Victoria, adjacent to where that initial human rights tribunal ruling took place. So extra sensitivity here for us being the neighboring municipality to Victoria, and then the same transit operator obviously operating in the whole region here. In Saanich, we're seeing large rises in cycling trips, 14% year over year in cycling, and our vehicle trips are relatively stagnant, actually reducing in parts of Saanich. There's a little bit of context. So we're here today to share some examples of what we've built, for right or for wrong, but what's on the ground in Saanich and what we've learned from that, and then we'll talk just a little bit about more what we might be doing in the future. So we've just finished a project on the southern part of Shelburne Street, where we've installed about a dozen floating bus stops. They're all of a similar design. We're in a very constrained environment here where the property line here is right at the back of the sidewalk, kind of a retrofit to an existing very narrow corridor. But we have applied many of the principles from the design guide, the tactile warning that both Dylan and Lacey have talked about. We have the shelters kind of squeezed in there. You see they're probably a little bit tighter to the bike lane than we'd like to see, but again, we're quite tight on space to make that happen. We also have kind of a bend out of the bike lane to make room for that shelter, also to provide a little bit of slowing of people riding bikes past this space. We have the bikes yield to pedestrians sign, which I see there's a question in the chat. I have a preference for this sign versus typical crosswalk signage, as well as using the yield teeth at the crosswalks. We've also extended, and this is just kind of turned around from where I took that last photo, the tactile devices at the crosswalks as well, crossing Shelburne Street, so that users have a similar experience, whether they're at the bus stops or they're at the adjacent crosswalks as part of this project. We have, this one's just still finishing up construction. It's on Mackenzie Avenue, just not too far from Shelburne Street. This is being built as part of an adjacent development at University Heights Mall. This is quite a large stop, ability to accommodate 3 transit vehicles at one time in this timing point layover. We have a little bit more space here, so a little bit deeper island, again, all level, with the tactile warning devices and the yield markings. And then there is a yield sign down here facing the opposite direction. This is a one-way bike lane, it's a little bit uphill through this space. I just want to share as well that in many contexts in Saanich, and I think here in the CRD shared by others, that this type of configuration where there's actually not an island is also an acceptable solution. That the interaction between buses and cyclists is relatively low, and having that trade-off of having the bus be able to pull out of the through lane, block the bike lane, load passengers, and then carry on. Yes, there's some waiting from cyclists, but we do find this is an acceptable solution in a number of cases still in Saanich. And then on Gorge Road, this particular stop was part of the pilot projects that were used to help develop the guide. This is a 2-way cycle path. It has residential only on one side, and it's a kind of open waterway park area on the left side of the screen here. These are fully raised islands with raised crosswalks that connect, and the main feature here I want to chat about is the rapid flashing beacons, which we have, which are all integrated in one large crossing. So there's 3 sets to cross both the bike lane onto the island platform and then across the road, crossing Gorge Road as well. This is probably one of the few deployments that I know of where the RRFBs actually are in place to reach the island platform bus stops. And we really kind of thought long and hard about a thoughtful way to do that, to comply with the early guidance that was presented by the Ministry of Transportation here, and kind of a requirement of our grant support of this project to comply with that guidance, which came right out of the HRT ruling, but also be thoughtful about where might RRFBs actually be warranted in a typical transportation setting. So you're able to integrate them here with the road crossing and the bike lane crossing was our solution to that. We've also deployed, as you can see, lots of tactiles are on the ground here, as well as the yield markings and yield written on the ground in this scenario in advance of the raised crosswalk where the crossing is crossing the 2-way bike lane. And so the yield paint as well as the yield teeth painted in front of the crossing there. And then we've also deployed kind of the more standard tactile braille signs, which are a Translake standard, but deployed those here as well to help support identification of the stop and where the stop may be. Also wanted to mention that we have a speed limit establishment policy in Saanich, and I think that's important because we always look at that as we're deploying these cycling corridors and improvements to make sure that we have the appropriate vehicle speed as well applied to the road. And again, that helps manage the speed of all the users, vehicles, and cyclists in their approach through the island platform bus stop. So that's one piece that doesn't get mentioned often, but is also think about managing that speed, both regulatory and through geometry. And then on the engagement side, we've, through the development of the stops on Gorge and on Shelburne Street, we've had a number of site visits with our local members from the CNIB. and continue to receive feedback from them around the value or not value of the RRFBs, as well as some really good critical feedback for us on the placement of the tactile devices, as well as what Dylan mentioned earlier, that kind of edge delineation, which we didn't have space for in Shelburne, but I think we've learned that that's something that we'd be looking to add in all projects going forward. We continue to meet with them in person and have written communication with the CNAB members. We've also had site visits with our local accessibility advisory committee here at Saanich, and we're quite happy to take both other regional staff and local consultants on tours of the infrastructure that we've built to share those lessons learned kind of on the ground and all learn together how we can improve going forward. Thanks for the opportunity to share today, and I'll pass it back to Brian. And I think we have one more presentation from Bartek.
Perfect. Thanks, Troy. Yeah, so our final presentation, we're going to move away from BC and across the country over to Montreal, who's been implementing island platform bus stops for many years. So Bartek Komorowski is an urban planner with the City of Montreal and has worked in the field of active mobility for 18 years and is currently leading a team at the City of Montreal's Urban Planning and Mobility Department. And Bartek will be speaking to some of the evolution of their designs and emerging practices. Over to you, Bartek.
Thanks, Brian. So let me just fire up my screen here. All right. Okay, so you should be seeing my screen now. Okay, so my team, as Brian mentioned, we put out design guidelines for the City of Montreal because we have 19 boroughs and also the central administration, which designs streets. So to keep everyone on the same page, we need guidelines. So I'll give you a little bit of background about Montreal, and which will explain why our approach is perhaps a little bit different than what we've seen so far today with all of the examples from around BC. I'll talk about our guidelines for island platforms with a raised bike lane, as well as what happens when the bike lane remains at roadway level. And then at the end, I'll discuss what our next steps are for the further evolution of our guidance. So I think it's very important to mention that Montreal is a very cold, snowy winter city. We typically have snow cover starting in mid to late November, and usually the snow sticks around till the end of March, sometimes even into April. We receive about 2.3 meters of total snowfall per year. And it's also important to mention that the City of Montreal clears all sidewalks. All 6,000 or so kilometers of sidewalks are cleared by the city. And now we also clear virtually all of our separated bicycle lanes. So by the fact that they're separated, they actually require a dedicated snow clearing operation. The winter imposes a lot of design constraints in the context of the island bus stops. It mainly means that we have to really limit the use of curbs, barriers, and other vertical elements that can hinder snow clearing and snow removal operations. The other thing to consider also is that plowing, and we can have anywhere from 100 to 150 plow passes per winter, abrades the surfaces. So it really also limits what kind of surface treatments and markings we can put down. Also quickly, as far as accessibility is concerned, our transit agency, the STM, designates some stops as accessible, but thus far, this only really pertains to wheelchair access. So a bus stop is deemed accessible if there's a 2.4 meter wide clear space from the curb perpendicular to the street, so which allows wheelchairs to maneuver. Tactile delineation and accessibility for visually impaired people is not considered, although it is our intention and the SDM's intention to work on that and to improve it. So we'll have a look at our platforms with raised bicycle lanes, which are by far the majority of our island platform bus stops. So we've been building these for many years. We have hundreds of them around the city. And until recently, our design standard was pretty much what you can see here on the screen. So we were aiming to provide a 1.5 meter wide platform. And then the bike lane would usually be 1.8 meters wide through the bus stop area for unidirectional and a 2.5 meter wide absolute minimum for bidirectionals. And there was no real tactile delimitation either on the platform or the sidewalk side. So as of about 3 years now, this is our new design approach. So after much discussion with our Universal Accessibility Advisory Committee, this is what we've come up with. When the bicycle lane is raised, we lose basically the delimitation provided by the curb. So we compensate by using tactile warning indicators. In Montreal, we use cast iron indicators because those are the only ones that we know that can withstand our winters. So we put them on both sides of the bike lane, basically from where the curb height drops below 60 millimeters. So up to 60 millimeters is cane detectable. Under 60 millimeters, it's no longer cane detectable. So that's where we provide the delineation. Other things to mention, our target width for the platform is 2.2 meters. So that a bus ramp is about 1.1 meters long. So that provides, that's one ramp length plus roughly one wheelchair length before crossing the bike lane. That's not always possible. So we tolerate reducing the island down to 1.5 at minimum. And because wheelchairs are actually welcome in bike lanes, so we consider that wheelchair users many of them will actually be interested into turning into the bike lane to roll in the bike lane. The absolute minimum width for the bike lane through the bus stop area is 1.5. Below 1.5, we're concerned with sort of larger format bikes or trailers that they could have trouble moving through the bus stop area. But the reduced width, what it does is it encourages people to cycle single file through the bike lane. So if a cyclist does slow down to yield to a crossing passenger, we don't want another cyclist passing them in the bus stop area. So yeah, as I said, this is kind of an important detail. So the ramp up to sidewalk level, it has to happen before the taper in the bike lane, because to allow snow plows to go through. Otherwise, it might wedge the snow plow. And it also actually, that little edge, if there were a curb on that tapered part of the island, it can actually be a hazard for cyclists. So if a cyclist clips that with their wheel, they can actually have a crash. So here's a rendering that we made before we actually built any of these, but you see nicely from above what it looks like. And here's an actual built example along our express bike corridor on Saint Denis. And recently we came up with a new design. So we found that the tapers, the concrete tapers, don't really serve much of a purpose other than visual. So we now sometimes build this taperless design. There's no hazard here for cyclists because everything is level. So and it allows us to shorten the island by quite a bit. So you can see the difference. So we go down from almost 20 meters long with a 2.5 meter wide bike lane down to 12 meters. So this can be very useful in many circumstances when there are other obstacles on the sidewalk, such as a driveway, for example. As for our roadway level platforms, when there's a roadway level bicycle lane, these do exist. They're not very frequent, but when the space is available, these are worthwhile because they avoid all kinds of expensive drainage work that results from raising the bike lane. So we don't have to modify any of the storm drains when we do this. So there's two ways that we do these. Either we do a curb cut at the back of the island, so basically at the back of the bus, that allows people to cross over to the sidewalk. And in this case, it's an uncontrolled crossing. So in Quebec, uncontrolled crossings are always yellow. Or the other approach is to do it at the front of the island. And then we can integrate that ramp into the traffic signals. So in that case, that becomes a signal controlled crossing. The advantage here is that we can also provide an auditory signal. So that can really help visually impaired users with wayfinding. The tricky part with these is that, unlike the examples we saw from Vancouver, we can't put any fences along the platform to prevent people from falling into the bike lane, because they are just kind of really hard to keep maintained in the winter. They prevent snow plows from properly clearing the island and the bike lane. So as a result, since we have no fence, we have to make the platform wide enough so that wheelchair users who are turning 90 degrees to get to the ramp, don't fall into the bike lane. So that means we need at least a 2.6 meter wide platform. And also, we can't narrow the bike lane we can't taper the bike lane through the bus stop area, because that would wedge the snowplow. So as a result, it means we have a wide bike lane and a very wide platform. So it's a very, very big footprint, and there simply aren't that many places in Montreal where we have the space to do this. So there are, but they're rare. So next steps. So what I've presented so far, I mean, we think it's okay for sort of run-of-the-mill bus stops that aren't very, particularly high volume. We do, however, know that this design probably doesn't work that well for high capacity, high volume bus stops, such as those by metro or rail stations, and probably not ideal for curbside BRT routes or very, very high frequency, high volume bus routes. Here we have one in front of a bus station. It's kind of hard to tell. Here the bike lane is concrete, but between the tactile warning indicators is actually the bike lane. And well, you can see where people are waiting. So the other thing about these types of stops is also some passengers may want to transfer from one bus to another on the same platform, so they won't always be crossing the bike lane. So that's another thing to take into consideration. We still don't have an official guideline for bidirectional cycle tracks that are appropriate for visually impaired users. What we're told by the community is that they find them more stressful than unidirectional bike lanes because there could be bikes coming from either direction. And also simply because the bike lane is bidirectional, the crossing is wider. So there's a much bigger space for them to cross to sort of safely get to the sidewalk, or from the sidewalk to the island. So we're still working through how to design this in a way that will be satisfactory. That being said, we do have bidirectional bike lanes that are in fairly low volume locations that are much lower, have much lower bicycle volumes than some of our unidirectional bike lanes. So we think that anyway, this is a problem that I think we can we'll find a solution to. And last but not least, we are looking for alternative delimitation devices, tactile delimitation devices. So it is very expensive to build all of these cast iron warning indicators all along the bus stops, and especially in a retrofit situation, because we have to actually pretty much reconstruct the sidewalk every time we want to have them on both sides of the bike lane. So we're looking at alternatives, be it some of the things we're looking at are these like textured pavers or this like porous concrete. So we'll see. That's ongoing. Probably in a year or two, we'll have some more guidance on this. So thank you. That's it for me.
Great. Thank you, Bartek. And thanks to all of our speakers, and join me in thanking all of our speakers here today. We covered a lot of ground. I know that was a lot of material and spanned a huge range of content, ranging from research to design guidance to education and programming and all sorts of other great information. So hopefully that inspires you and you can take some lessons back to your communities as well. Thanks as well to everybody who provided questions. There's a number of Q&A in the chat, and as we got started a little bit late due to the technical difficulties, we don't have time to go through all of the questions, but we thought we could highlight a few kind of project-specific or questions briefly, and then what we were thinking is for some of the broader questions that are coming through the chat, there's an upcoming Transportation Talks article that ITE Canada will be publishing, and so we thought we could maybe do an article that summarizes some of the lessons from today and answers some of the more broader questions that we have here. So I'll open up a few questions, but I do first just want to apologize again for some of the technical difficulties with the meeting link and reiterate that ITE Canada will be sharing the full recording and information to all participants, and we'll be forwarding information for PDH certificates via email as well. So with the few minutes we have remaining, I have 3 questions that are quite specific and hopefully fairly quick to answer. The first one, Lacey, I'm going to put you on the spot here. There's a question if you could just clarify the one-way cycling aspect of the revised bus stop design, and if there are two-way cycling facilities on the approaches to the stop, and they yield to each and navigate like a single lane bidirectional bridge through the stop. If you could just help clarify that.
Yes, that's exactly it. It's bidirectional on the approaches, 3 meters wide, and it goes down to a 1.8 meter facility. So there's that yield condition for cyclists, which will be shown through signage and paint markings. And really what that was to address was that piece about wanting the cyclists to stop. And so really narrowing the cycling facility down so that when the ramp deploys from the bus, it's covering that area and really highlighting that pedestrians have the right of way in that area.
Perfect, thanks. It'll be interesting to see how that works in the field once it's actually built and see how that human behavior works there. A second question, another kind of specific one for Katerina. I'll put you on the spot here. Regarding the digital inventory and online map angle, the question is, are there plans to integrate that with major providers like Google or otherwise to provide warnings to users at island platform bus stops?
So the intent that we're having is to actually integrate it on the website for TransLink, because you can do trip planning that way. Eventually, we'll have it integrated into our own software. We can actually see it in the system. There's about 76 of these floating bus stops. There's another 12 pending. So there's a lot of work on actually getting the inventory first, cleaning it out and seeing what we could do. That could be something we could definitely investigate, but we're still in the preliminary stages. So as it gets developed, we can definitely share that info with everyone.
Great, thanks. And I have one more. I'm going to open this up to anyone. Is about drainage and how you handle drainage to keep curb height high enough for bus boarding for low floor buses. I don't know if any of the practitioners have experience or thoughts on drainage considerations. Dylan? Yeah.
I'll just, I mean, it's impossible to answer that generally. Yeah, you've got to deal with it. You got to address it. And there's a host of ways to do it. It depends a lot on the bus stop type that we were talking about. Like Bartek was talking about roadway grade. If the bike lane's at roadway grade, that can in some ways potentially simplify, but it just really depends. Some will plate over the gutter pan if they have to. Of course, that's a bit of a pain to maintain. I really like interim height. Check bike lane, you can use that whatever 2-inch high beveled or vertical curb actually to channelize flows off of the platform and from the sidewalk, through the stop. There's so many ways to approach it, but sometimes, anyway, yeah, you got to deal with it though. Of course, it's got to be figured out. But those are the weeds that, generally speaking, there's always something you can do to address that.
Okay, thanks. Any other thoughts on that one from any other speakers? No. Okay. Well, apologies we didn't get to more questions, but I want to be respectful of our time here today. So again, we will follow up with a full recording of the webinar, the PDH credits, and then stay tuned for an upcoming transportation talks where we can answer some of the broader questions and do a bit of an overview of this session. And I'll pass up to Borg for some final remarks. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you much, Brian. And thanks again for all great presentation from Brian and all wonderful speakers. Now, I would like to just remind a little bit about the upcoming ITE Canada and the CRSP event again. So ITE Canada, they will call for volunteer for committee and panelists starting in 2026. They will due on October 30, 2025. Call for abstract until November 3rd, 2025. And then that's it for 2026 ITE Canada Conference in Victoria on May 31st to June 3rd. And also save the date for the virtual technical symposium on December 3, 2025. More information about district and event and session event will be found in the itecanada.org. For CRSP, that's the 2026 CRSP Road Safety Conference will be in Halifax on June 14 to 17, and call for abstract will be in October with the late November deadline. And there will be another 2 more October webinar in CRSP, and they will post it on next week. And they will be free for ITE member and the CARSP member. And one is Vision Zero, and the other one automatic speed cameras. Okay, lastly, please fill in the survey form. I think we'll be sending the survey form to everyone. That will definitely helping us to more information for this webinar and also future event. Once again, thanks for all presentation and thanks for participants for this webinar. Have a great day and a week. Goodbye and see you in the future event. Thank you very much.